All right. Well, as we have folks hopping in and reporting where they're coming in from, let's go ahead and we'll get started. So good afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining ThreatX's live Q&A, talking with experts Nick, Aleks, and Dolev Farhi on modern web application attacks. We've purposely designed this webinar to be as interactive as possible. So we'll be stopping along the way, answering questions that come up in the chat. So by all means and purposes, please do not be shy, as we're excited to connect you with these experts. And with that, we'll hop on in. So today, joining me for a session is Nick Aleks, one of the authors of Blackhat GraphQL, founder of DEFCON Toronto, and also patent engineer, distinguished speaker, and all-around rock star in the Toronto cybersecurity community. So Nick, if you'd like to hop in and say hi, please feel free to.
Hey everyone, and excited to take some of your questions in regards to API hacking and GraphQL hacking. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Up next, we have Nick's counterpart, Dolev Farhi, Principal Security Engineer, also at Wealth Security. Dolev is also an author of Blackhat GraphQL alongside Nick, also a founder of DEFCON Toronto, and enjoys spending some of his free time just researching vulnerabilities, especially in the IoT space. So Dolev, feel free to hop in and say hi to everybody.
Hey everyone, very excited to be here and take your questions. And we're also excited to share some of the things that we've been talking about and exploring and writing about in the last year and a half, I would say. So happy to share those insights with you.
Thank you, Dolev. Next, we have Jeremy Ventura, our field CISO on the ThreatX side. Jeremy has been an industry leader in cybersecurity for a number of years, focusing on vulnerability management, incident response, security operations. But most of the time, you can see him speaking in the media or even on podcasts. So Jeremy, if you'd like to hop in and say hi as well.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. And Nick and Dolev, appreciate you guys taking the time out of your busy day to join us for this interactive conversation. Look forward to it.
Lastly, myself, Cindy Cafaro, I'm a product expert who's focused on cybersecurity solutions related to SOAR, API security, and general application security. So we're really excited to be connecting everybody with some of these experts. And with that, we will dive on into the first aspect of our conversation. So for the sake of the audience, Dolev, I'd love your help explaining why teams are transitioning to use GraphQL endpoints versus REST endpoints.
It's a good question. GraphQL is pretty hyped up these days. And typically, one of the primary reasons why companies are looking to adopt GraphQL is because they see other companies doing it at large scale. But really, the GraphQL solves some challenges that REST APIs and other APIs have, which is how do you optimize the process of fetching data from an API endpoint when that data is quite complex and could be a combination of multiple services under the hood. So GraphQL basically provides you a really interesting interface into querying data as well as writing data that in an equivalent application that uses REST might be a little bit more challenging to complete. And we're more than happy to give more concrete examples around that.
Yeah, and digging into a topic I know will probably be explained a little bit further in your book, both Dolev, Nick, would love to get your understanding of how attackers or pen testers are exploiting GraphQL endpoints versus REST. Is it similar tactics? Is it different?
I can take that away. It's the same, but also a little bit different. So the vulnerabilities that exist in REST APIs that we're all probably familiar with still apply in the GraphQL world, except that there are small differences in how you would interact with the GraphQL API that changes some very fundamental things that we are all used to, both from a red team perspective as well as a blue team perspective. I can talk forever about this, but I'll touch on like the main points. So in REST APIs, you typically have like an endpoint and like an HTTP method, and those two things typically describe what the client is trying to do. So like a post to some like API users endpoint may mean that somebody's trying to create a user, as an example. In GraphQL, that's not the case. GraphQL doesn't really put a lot of attention on the method. It's going to be, for the most part, a post request. But the client intention is described in the post payload. So there's going to be something that looks a little bit like JSON. You can see that on the right side here on the slide. This is basically what the client is trying to do. Maybe reading some information, grabbing pieces of information, or writing data. But the gist here is that the client intention is described by the payload as opposed to the method and the endpoint that they're calling.
That's great. And Dolev, I want to just piggyback on something you mentioned there. So, you know, we hear a lot in these different webinars that we do, especially ThreatX being an API security company, just organizations going through digital transformation, the more and more usage of APIs in general, whether it's REST, whether it's GraphQL. So Nick, I'll pose this question to yourself. It's a tough question to answer because it's so broad, but why is API security so important? And even specifically, the two of you work for a company, well, it's simple. So, you know, maybe a little context about your business, your organization, and kind of what you're doing today to protect your organization from API security threats.
Yeah, for sure. It's a really good question, multi-layered. I'll try to dissect that as best as possible. So why is API security so important? Well, if you look at a lot of SaaS-based applications that are on the cloud, a lot of them are being built with an API-first approach, meaning that the backend data structures, all the different methods are all being engineered with a API that either could be used by a customer directly or a subsystem, all making requests to that particular API. Now, the reason why it's extremely important to protect APIs is mainly because this is where a lot of systems and customers get direct access to the heart of your applications, where all the data lies. So from a confidentiality perspective, APIs are extremely important with protecting customer information that you may store within them. The other thing as well is that APIs are also an area where you could potentially damage the integrity of the data behind them as well. Often a lot of APIs will allow you to do executions such as modifying data, running actions, or certain transactions. And these are also particular types of requests that you want to make sure you're monitoring for and have like the proper controls to ensure that only authorized and authenticated users are able to perform them. Now, a bit of context and background into our APIs. Wealthsimple is a fintech company here in Canada. We do take an API first based approach with designing all of our systems, both internally as well as externally, providing connectors and API endpoints for some of our partners to be able to use some of our services. And some of the things that we've put in place to protect our APIs are strong, robust monitoring controls, really strong preventative controls, such as web application firewalls. Yeah, happy to dive into some of the additional controls that we put into place with protecting our own API. But yeah, those some of the high level overview of why API security is so important and what Wealthsimple does.
Yeah, Nick, and I love how you started to go into how Wealthsimple is really addressing this API security aspect of, again, how security is evolving just based on technology and how technology is being adopted. I guess if we could take a step further and if you could explain what would be like your first recommendations to organizations prioritizing API security, what would be the first things that you'd suggest that they put in place?
Yeah, one of the first things that I'd say that organizations who either are looking at developing an API or already have one and they're looking to harden it is to, the very first point is get some observability, get some visibility around what this API does exactly. So if you don't have really strong documentation, build some. It's extremely important to have a very robust and up-to-date documentation to get a good understanding of what your API truly does. From there, you'll be easy. You'll find it relatively easy to identify endpoints that aren't either being used or certain functions that aren't being used. And one of the best ways to secure something is to just delete it or remove it. So decommissioning endpoints that aren't being used is absolutely important, but having that documentation, having some visibility and some logging behind it is really the first step. From there, you'll be able to then look at how some of your customers are using your API by looking at some of these logs. You can then, from there, identify where there's potential anomalies, where threat actors are potentially trying to poke and prod and try to find weaknesses within your API, and see what type of payloads are being sent and how your API is actually responding to these particular requests. And then from there, you can either then try to filter out, strengthen the authorization and authentication controls at your business logic layer, or look at investing into building in some either edge protections or web application firewall to drop certain requests that may look malicious.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
there
a
you
great
got it, folks.
Yeah, that's a great point there, Nick. And Dolev, I have a follow-up question to what Nick just mentioned right there. Nick mentioned kind of, the whole theme of you don't know what you don't know, right? Until you get some observability and some asset management and visibility into the endpoints and how your development's creating. I just read a report last week that IBM posted that was all about rogue and zombie APIs. What threat do you see that portraying for organizations, especially when it comes to just digging a little bit more into that kind of visibility and the observance of APIs? Do we think that rogue and zombie API theory is really going to become explosive in the next couple of years as development teams continue to build and build?
It's an interesting point and interesting question. I feel like APIs is a constantly evolving thing. You're always changing things, but there are certain things that you cannot change that you're kind of stuck with because of legacy systems and because of integrations that you cannot get rid of. And that becomes some sort of a technical debt over time. Things evolve in the IT ecosystems. You might be changing authorization layer. You might be changing the way you do authentication, but you end up getting stuck with newer APIs as well as legacy APIs, at least the ones that you know about. I'm not even mentioning about the ones you don't know, but these problems do exist, especially in large organizations. And sometimes it's just not so easy to decommission something as much as we really want to. There's a lot of dependencies and a lot of worry around what is it going to happen? What are we missing if we kill this API right now? And so lack of tooling, of observability tooling, could actually impact how quickly you can decommission something, because you're going to be afraid that you might be causing outages if you take something down, but you forgot about this integration with this small little company somewhere, or you forgot about this internal system that actually uses that every now and then. So I do think that it will become a problem, and it's already a problem for larger companies.
Thank you, Dolev, for going into the detail of how, sometimes we can forget that these APIs can be used for partners, for legacy systems, for a multiple of aspects in your ecosystem, and why it is so important to know how all of those pieces work together before decommissioning part of your APIs. So thank you for the depth of answer with that. Diving a little bit more into your upcoming book, Blackhat GraphQL, generally would love a consensus between the both of you. What inspired you to write the book?
Dolev, I'll let you go.
Yeah, when I joined Wealthsimple 2 years ago, Wealthsimple is heavily invested in the GraphQL space. To be honest, I joined Wealthsimple and I knew nothing about GraphQL. So what I typically do on a personal level when I want to learn something is I buy physical books. Physical books force me to read cover to cover. And if I don't do that, I feel really bad for spending money on something, and it's visible, it's physically there. And I know that I need to get to it. So it's easier for me to just accomplish that, just finish reading the book. So I was looking for GraphQL security books back in the day, and there wasn't any. The only thing that got close was actually Corey's book, Hacking APIs, which has a section on GraphQL hacking, which was released just a few months ago. So when I needed those resources, they didn't exist. There were some other books around how to build full stack applications with GraphQL, or learning about GraphQL as a technology, but not necessarily from a security standpoint. So that's always something that I personally needed. And I feel like if I need something and it's not there, there might be an opportunity to contribute and create something that's going to be valuable for other people who will follow my steps, perhaps. So I never wrote a book in my life. I contributed to some books, but it's never like, I never wrote a book, cover to cover. So I was personally very scared of doing that by myself. So I teamed up with Nick, and we pitched the idea of creating or writing a GraphQL security book. And we teamed up with No Starch Press, who we value a lot as a publisher, and they're well known in the IT security space. And they like the idea because they also heard about GraphQL, and it's becoming more common to see that. We also hear that from pen testers that we talk to. They constantly see that every now and then. So we took on the challenge of proposing a book idea and got the contract and started to work on it.
That's truly inspiring how you set out to learn about GraphQL yourself, recognized the gap, and then went forth with actually building the resource that you thought that you have. That's really awesome. I'm curious to hear your side of things as well, Nick.
Yeah, for sure. I tell folks this all the time. If you want to become an expert in a particular area, just agree to write a book on it. So when Dolev reached out and said, "Hey, we'd love to team up with you to write a book on GraphQL," I said I'd be, truly honored. My partner in crime is something that I would absolutely love to do with you. And already we had done a little bit of GraphQL hacking, a bit of research, wrote a few tools on it. So it seemed like we were already somewhat set up for success. We could take the research that we've been working towards and just, apply it to a book that, as Dolev mentioned, we wish we had when we were learning GraphQL, especially the offensive security side of it. And if there's one thing that, both Dolev and I are extremely passionate about, it's giving back to the community. And so this is why, we wanted to write this book, open source these tools that can be used not just by simple engineers to harden and secure our own GraphQL deployments, but to also have other engineers and security researchers, bug bounty researchers go and be able to feel confident that the tools and the research that we've put out there publicly can be used to really truly strengthen and harden the applications and APIs that teams are building now with GraphQL. So it's truly an honor to be along with Dolev on this ride and to be able to give back to the community.
Now, I have to ask if there is one piece that you both hope folks take away from reading the book. What is one core piece that you hope that they walk away with?
Yeah, I can answer that. I'd say there's two things that I'd really hope folks would be able to get out of this book. One is to have a very hands-on hacker's perspective on what GraphQL is all about and feel really confident when interacting with GraphQL. And that's ultimately like how we wanted to write the book, is put it into someone's hands who may not know anything about GraphQL. Maybe they have like a basic understanding of how APIs may work and have like some background in computer science, but to really look at this book from end to end and feel like, okay, not only do I understand what GraphQL is right now, and I have a good concept of what its anatomy looks like and what its attack surface looks like, but then also the other flip side is to be able to then run a couple of these tests against any GraphQL API that they come across, either it's one that they're building themselves or a part of a bug bounty program, and to be able to assess the level of security posture for that API. So it's really twofold on my end. Dolev, anything on your side?
Yeah, so I would probably say the same thing, maybe in a slightly different version. I think there's one requirement to the book, in my personal opinion. Read it cover to cover, try every single exercise in the book. You will learn a lot, not just about GraphQL, about like maybe other things you've never tried before, maybe Docker, maybe some virtualization, things like that. And you'll be able to get a lot just by hands-on experimenting, in your lab, just by following the exercises. You don't need a powerful computer for this. You don't need a whole lot of resources for this. Just motivation, I would say. And we are we approached this book in kind of interesting ways, and I think that we put a lot of emphasis on, being curious, try different things, take what you learned, go apply that in some bug bounty program, or in your own company if you're using GraphQL. So I really hope that we will be able to motivate people to maybe write even their own book, who knows, but to learn about GraphQL and contribute to the space, because it's a growing space. There's a security community within this space, but it's a niche. So there's definitely room for innovation and more tooling and more education. So we hope that we'll be able to inspire some people to follow.
Thanks, Dolev. That's great. And for anyone that's on the webcast right now, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We actually do have one question. Dolev, I'm going to hand it right back to you on this question because you just started to talk about it a little bit. One of the questions is, besides just reading, is it also interactive labs or exercises? And I think you had just mentioned that there is. Do you want to go a little bit further into kind of what that entails and kind of the mindset behind actually putting interactive labs as well?
Yeah. So the book has 10 chapters. Let's see if I'll remember them all. But you start with the introduction to GraphQL. We'll basically assume that you don't have any knowledge on GraphQL. Like Nick said, maybe some IT background, computer science, and so on. You don't need to be a programmer by any means to be successful at this. So we take you from teaching you about GraphQL to setting up your own lab so you can do everything locally. And you don't need to set up anything. You don't need to program any applications. We have built applications over time that kind of align really nicely with the book, because we are using, most of the book are tools that we built and some tools that other people built as well. So we take you from zero to like a full-blown lab where you practice pen testing exercises and anything from initial reconnaissance to understanding how like authentication and authorization works in GraphQL applications, injections, whether it's like SQL injections or OS injections and things like that, as well as things that are impacting client side, like cross-site scripting. So there's a lot of like OAuth-like type of exercises or vulnerabilities with exercises, so that you'll be able to learn a lot, both on the client as well as the server side of things. And each chapter is, I would say, can be looked at as like a standalone chapter. You can read it and understand that specific topic. There's no like specific prerequisite other than the lab that you need to set up. There is no specific prerequisite. Like you don't have to, you can read it in any order. But we try to create an order that makes sense for somebody who never tried GraphQL to open the book, give it a read so that the sequence makes sense. But it can also be used as like a sort of like a cheat sheet, or like we do have some cheat sheet sections in the book that you can just go and use as a to-do list for your next pen test as well.
That's awesome. I love the hands-on aspect for it. As we know, people learn different ways. So, you got the visual, you got the people that love to read, but you also have the hands-on getting that technical experience and guiding individuals through that. So kudos to you guys. I think that's awesome. I have another question for you, Nick. This is the $1 million question. It was in reference to what we talked about earlier about the future of API security, some of the risks it pose, the work that you guys are doing, fighting the fight at Wealthsimple. $1 million question. How do you get security and DevOps to work closely together in fragmented organizations where they may not talk to each other? Is there any best practices and recommendations that you've seen where organizations typically try to struggle to get API security either introduced in development that's not necessarily always security focused with a mindset? So any best practice recommendations, Nick, for you?
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely a really good question. One that was raised a lot at a couple other conferences that I've been speaking at over October Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And one of the things that I will say is like probably the most successful thing that we've done over at Simple is really champion the Security Champions program. And we've had it now for about 3 years. And essentially, what a Security Champions program is you pick at least, you get one representative from one engineering team to come and join the security team. And that could be everything from, joining the team for 1 day a week to just learn a bit more about security. Let's say they're a little bit interested, they want to dabble in developing a new tool, solve a problem that security is facing, or even just jump into the middle of a firefighting of an incident. All of this really helps elevate and promote your security culture. So I'd say organizations that have a really strong security culture are the ones who could really benefit, not just in the API security space, but in just security in general, when they really think about how to build security into the products, into the pipelines for what they offer their customers. And so the Security Champions program has been tremendously successful here. We've had a couple of folks even like who were champions come in and actually join the security team full time afterwards. So I think that it's a really great way to permeate security and the tooling and the education back to teams afterwards. And when you provide tools that security either builds internally to help protect our APIs, such as building a couple of tests with something like nuclei, you put that into the pipeline on how folks are actually shipping and delivering code, then the security champions can be the ones who usher and introduce these new controls to the team, saying, hey, we're making the secure path also the fast and seamless path for how we ship code. And this is, one particular gate that actually will attack our API and find potential vulnerabilities or issues with it. And so once you've got that really strong security culture, I'd say that's it's $1 million answer, or at least as close in the security community as we have to a silver bullet in regards to security.
That is an awesome answer, and I've never heard of the Security Champion program before. So that is one to definitely note in our books, and also just reemphasize creating a security culture is hugely important. So thank you for that insight, Nick. I know we're coming up on the last few minutes. The last question that I think everybody's going to be asking themselves this next few months with the turn of the year, what are some of your predictions for next year as it relates to how API security will continue to grow? And this could go to both Nick or Dolev.
I think that we're going to see a trend in, at least I'll start from tooling. We're going to see a trend around API security that's not necessarily web application firewalls. There are startups out there that started emerging that complement web application firewalls. So on the API defense side, we're going to see improvements, in my opinion. GraphQL is one example of a new technology that introduces new problems, old problems as well as new problems. And I think that we're going to have more of that. There's already other things like gRPC and other type of technologies that are not necessarily new, but there are alternatives to REST. And I feel like we got a little bit confident in the REST space, but it's going to change a little bit, and it will require a lot of adoption and to adapt our tooling to actually solve the challenges that we're trying to solve right now for REST, but in other technologies.
Yeah, to add on that, I think as a lot of organizations mature with their own APIs and they adopt technologies like GraphQL, just being super cognizant of the security controls that they have in place will actually work to protect their API workflows and workloads. I think is extremely important. As Dolev mentioned, our traditional REST API controls, such as like rate limits, status codes. Security teams may have this false sense of security, just thinking that they can apply some of these REST-based defenses over the GraphQL side of things, and really, this is really far from the truth or best practice. You can imagine, let's say, a threat actor potentially trying to do a distributed account takeover, or trying to do some password stuffing against a series of your accounts through your API. If they're doing that via REST, you can potentially see, oh, I'm getting a bunch of 403 errors with these post requests, and you might have a traditional control that will look at that particular request, look at the IP, and see, oh, this is clearly someone trying to just brute force and get into a couple of accounts here. So let's go ahead and like drop or ban that individual's IP address. But on the GraphQL side, we've developed and built tools such as CrackQL and find sort of exploits in the ways that GraphQL has given the clients a lot of power in how they craft their requests by batching them into a single HTTP request and being able to stuff these credentials within a particular payload into a GraphQL server. And you can imagine that monitor that protects your REST APIs would not necessarily trigger, because if you're stuffing a bunch of credentials in a single GraphQL request, you're sending it to the API, that monitor will not trigger, mainly because most, as Dolev mentioned, status codes will return with a 200, even if there are errors in it. And if they only see one request coming in, they'll say, oh, that was just like one attempt at trying to potentially log in. But if it's stuffed with a bunch of aliases, which we mentioned it in the book, the threat actor could have potentially a couple of passwords and credentials and access tokens to your APIs from these types of attacks. So I'd say a trend that I'm seeing is APIs are giving customers and clients and end users a lot of power, and that's great from a usability perspective and a user experience perspective. But once you start to shift that and you put a lot of those controls and the power into the hands of the clients, you need to really start to ask these questions. How am I validating these requests? How do I ensure that I'm still trusting that the data that's being sent to my API is secure? I think that's something that a lot of security teams are going to have to grapple with in the next couple of years.
Well, thank you both, Nick and Dolev, for answering our slew of questions. And we couldn't agree with you more. Just like what Stan Lee said, with great power comes great responsibility. So we certainly appreciate both of you hopping on and spending time with us today. For the folks who have continued to stay tuned in, again, we greatly appreciate your presence. Keep your eyes peeled for Nick and Dolev's book, Blackhat GraphQL, getting published early next year. As I mentioned, some of the content is available today on No Starch, so go and check it out. And if you had fun or you enjoyed today's session, please tune in for our next, focusing on a Thanksgiving Day special, talking with Neil Bridges on giving thanks to CISOs. So thank you everybody again, Nick and Dolev. We appreciate your time and we hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.